I was reviewing an old transcript I had no professional reason left to proofread, an old habit from 39 years behind a stenography machine, when my daughter-in-law announced, over an ordinary Sunday dinner, that she'd already arranged for our family's annual reunion to move from its usual first week of July to a different week in August, at a different resort entirely, since August apparently worked better for everyone's schedules. I remember setting down my fork slowly, the transcript still open on the side table where I'd left it, right before her announcement rearranged the entire shape of that dinner. I had no idea that the deeded week she'd just casually reassigned was the exact week my husband had died. 5 years earlier, standing at the grill on that same resort's own patio, and that within the following week, I would contact the resort's ownership office directly to make absolutely certain that particular week could never again be moved, exchanged, or reassigned by anyone but me. My name is Cordelia Whitmore. I'm 73 years old. I spent 39 years as a court reporter, the kind of career that teaches you that the exact words on the record matter enormously, and teaches you, too, that a date carries a specific, unchangeable weight that cannot simply be moved around for anyone's scheduling convenience. My husband Roland died 5 years ago, a sudden stroke while standing at the grill during our own family's annual 4th of July reunion. The kind of ordinary, joyful afternoon that gave no warning at all. I remember him calling out that the burgers were nearly ready, and turning around moments later to find him already on the patio floor, spatula still in his hand. Grief that arrives in the middle of your family's happiest yearly tradition teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the smell of charcoal in ocean air can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep returning to that same place anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire tradition die alongside him. Roland and I bought our deeded timeshare week, the first full week of July, at a modest oceanfront resort 28 years ago, back when our own children were still young enough to build sandcastles rather than bring their own families. We sat with a sales representative for nearly an entire afternoon before deciding, Roland carefully working through the math on a yellow legal pad the same way he approached every significant purchase, insisting we choose a week specifically tied to a holiday, rather than a random week that might feel arbitrary within a few years. This has to be a week nobody has an excuse to skip, he told me. We chose that particular week deliberately, close enough to the holiday that extended family could easily justify the trip. And over nearly 3 decades, it became the fixed point. Our entire extended family organized itself around every single year. Cousins who otherwise rarely saw each other. Aging relatives who counted on that one guaranteed week to stay connected. After Roland died there, standing at that same patio grill he'd manned every single year of our marriage, that week became something closer to sacred to me. The place where his absence and his most vivid memory existed in exactly the same physical space. Roland and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a high school civics teacher for nearly 35 years, patient with every student who thought government class was pointless before he found the one debate that changed their mind. The kind of man who believed a well-run classroom taught students more about fairness than any textbook could. When I told him 4 years into our marriage that I wanted to pursue formal stenography training rather than continue as a part-time secretary, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest training weeks, and he did, for years, without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully transcribed proceeding at a time, 39 years behind the machine, until I finally retired with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young reporter early in my career, a woman convinced she'd never develop enough speed to keep pace with fast-talking attorneys whom I spent an entire year quietly coaching after our shared shifts, never once mentioning to the court administrator how much extra time it actually required. She went on to a respected career of her own in the federal courts, and years later a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before anyone in my own family learned to take my own judgment for granted. Roland didn't live to see the reunion tradition reach its current significance for our grandchildren. He died 5 years before Rhiannon's own involvement began, and some evenings I still catch myself wanting to ask him what he thinks of a particular grandchild's growing personality, before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular conversation anymore. I have 2 children. Ginevra, my daughter, is an architect, 3 time zones away, precise and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope an architect's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening without fail, a habit that started the year Roland died and never once lapsed since. Nolan, my son, is 43, a project manager, married for 7 years to a woman named Rhiannon Castellane, 36, whose growing career as a professional event planner he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making her own scheduling preferences sound like simple practicality. Rhiannon grew up in a family that treated tradition as something inherently negotiable, subject to whatever arrangement proved most convenient in any given year. The kind of household where sentimental attachment to a specific date was considered less important than optimizing everyone's actual availability. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's comfort with rescheduling deeply meaningful dates comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that rescheduling indefinitely, especially once it starts targeting the exact week your husband died. She told me a story once early in her relationship with Nolan, back when we still spoke easily and often about her own family's habit of moving their holiday gatherings around every single year based on whoever's schedule happened to be busiest, never once anchoring the tradition to a specific date that actually meant something beyond convenience. My family always said the people mattered more than the day, she told me. I grew up believing that any date could be replaced by any other date as long as everyone eventually showed up somewhere. I remember thinking at the time that it reflected a genuinely flexible, easygoing family, worthy of real admiration. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around treating dates as interchangeable, and that the one date in my own life that was never interchangeable would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to without my consent. About 3 years ago, once Rhiannon's own event planning business had grown considerably, she began offering to help coordinate the family's annual reunion logistics, genuinely useful at first, handling group dinner reservations and coordinating who was staying in which unit. I welcomed her involvement warmly, grateful for another set of capable hands managing details I found increasingly tedious each year. I did make a point, early on, of explaining clearly that the specific week itself, the first week of July, was not something I was ever willing to consider changing, given everything that particular week represented. She told me she understood completely. It would take 3 years of careful, creeping erosion before I understood exactly how much that understanding had actually meant. For the first year of Rhiannon's involvement, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Logistics running more smoothly than ever, the specific week remaining exactly where it had always been. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was during the second year when Rhiannon mentioned, almost as an aside while finalizing that year's reservations, that she'd looked into whether our particular timeshare week could be exchanged for a different property entirely through the resort network's own point system, framing the inquiry as simply exploring options rather than anything I'd actually requested. I sat with that comment for a long moment, understanding immediately that she had begun treating a deeply specific, deliberately chosen week as an interchangeable asset, though I told myself in that moment that she simply didn't yet understand how deliberate that original choice had actually been. The second incident happened when I discovered entirely by accident that Rhiannon had contacted the resort's own membership services directly, inquiring about the general process for converting a fixed, deeded week into a floating, points based membership, which would have eliminated the guaranteed specific week entirely in favor of whatever availability happened to exist in any given year. The resort representative, appropriately cautious given that my name alone appeared on the actual deed, declined to process anything without my own direct authorization and mentioned the inquiry to me during an unrelated maintenance fee call. I had to sit with that information for a long time, understanding exactly how close that particular tradition had come to losing its fixed anchor entirely without my knowledge. The third incident happened when Rhiannon began describing the annual reunion in conversations with extended family members that I happened to overhear as something she was working on modernizing for the whole family's convenience, framing her own growing influence over the event's logistics as a necessary improvement rather than a departure from the specific tradition it had always been. I mentioned to Nolan, gently, that I found the growing assumption about the reunion's own fixed date increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Rhiannon simply cared a great deal about making the event work well for everyone's busy schedules, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she framed a detail that small. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Rhiannon on the phone with a cousin, describing the reunion's traditional first week of July timing as something the family had simply fallen into out of habit, rather than acknowledging it as the specific week tied to Roland's own death, a detail she seemed to have genuinely stopped mentioning to anyone at all. I stood in the hallway a moment longer than necessary, understanding that the story being told about our family's own most significant tradition had already begun losing the very history that made it meaningful in the first place. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for that year's reunion, sitting around Nolan and Rhiannon's own kitchen table with a group calendar spread between us, when Rhiannon mentioned, almost as an aside, that she thought it might be worth considering a different week entirely for the following year, since several younger family members had mentioned scheduling conflicts with the traditional July timing. "Cordelia, you understand, right?" she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about changing something meaningful. It's just about making sure everyone can actually attend." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss moving the specific week my husband died as a matter of scheduling optimization, as though nearly 3 decades of deliberate tradition and the exact place where I'd last seen him alive were an inconvenient footnote rather than the very reason any of us gathered there at all. The sixth incident happened when Rhiannon's own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter handle the family's vacation logistics with such practical efficiency. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for making sure a tradition actually works for the people living through it now, rather than staying frozen in whatever it used to be." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually understood what that specific week had cost me and what it still meant. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when I overheard Rhiannon mention to Nolan in their own kitchen that she'd already begun exploring alternative resort options for the following summer, framing the exploration as simply prudent planning rather than something requiring my own input first, given that my name alone remained on the actual property's ownership documents. I stood there, having personally chosen that exact week and that exact resort with my own husband nearly 3 decades earlier, listening to my own ownership treated as an administrative detail rather than the actual legal reality it represented. The eighth incident happened when I overheard Rhiannon telling a younger cousin at a family gathering that the reunion specific week had originally been chosen more or less arbitrarily, simply because it fit the family's schedule at the time, a description that erased entirely the deliberate reasoning Roland and I had actually applied when selecting it decades earlier. I stood near the doorway a moment longer than necessary, understanding that the story being passed down to the youngest generation had already begun losing its actual origin entirely. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Rhiannon is just trying to make the reunion work better for a growing family. Nolan loves me, even if he doesn't correct her firmly enough. The tradition is still happening every year, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that the exact place and moment of my husband's death had become an inconvenient scheduling detail in someone else's more efficient version of our family's tradition. There was one afternoon, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to addressing this more directly. Rhiannon called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if she quietly explored converting our deeded week into the resort's floating point system, explaining that it would give the family considerably more flexibility going forward, and that she'd handle all the actual paperwork herself if I simply agreed in principle. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud exactly what that particular week represented and why I would never willingly give up its fixed, guaranteed place on the calendar. Then I thought about Nolan's own happiness, about how much he valued his wife's organizational skills, about how a direct confrontation might feel like an attack on the very idea of the family growing and changing. I told her I needed to think about it and told myself one more time that the moment to address this fully hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the Sunday dinner. Nolan met Rhiannon at a friend's own wedding where she'd been the event's professional planner, and I remember the first time he brought her by my house, watching her admire the framed photographs from every reunion we'd ever attended, asking thoughtful questions about the resort and the tradition itself. She seemed, that first visit, genuinely curious rather than simply polite, and I remember thinking, watching her that afternoon, how naturally she seemed to fit into a family that valued careful, deliberate planning. I would think about that first visit considerably more in a different light once I understood how selectively that same careful planning eventually got applied. We gathered, as we did most Sundays, at Nolan and Rhiannon's own house, an ordinary family dinner that I had no particular reason to expect would become anything other than exactly that. Partway through the meal, Rhiannon mentioned, brightly, that she had good news about the reunion planning, that she'd already secured a beautiful new property for the following summer, a resort in a different state entirely, for the second week of August, instead of our traditional first week of July. Since August had turned out to work considerably better for the younger cousin's own school schedules. She'd already spoken with several family members, she added, and everyone seemed genuinely excited about the change. I set down my fork slowly. The table quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. I appreciate the effort that clearly went into researching that option, I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be. But the first week of July isn't simply a tradition we fell into. It's the deeded week your father-in-law and I purchased nearly 3 decades ago. And it's the exact week he died, standing at that resort's own grill, 5 years ago this coming summer. I paused, letting that land fully before continuing. That week isn't available for rescheduling, because it was never actually yours to reschedule in the first place. The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the dinner itself. Nolan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion first, then something closer to dawning horror. Rhiannon's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and pale. "Cordelia," she said quietly. "I didn't realize that was still how you felt about the specific dates." I didn't answer the confused murmurs that followed. I finished my own dinner as calmly as I could manage, thanked Nolan and Rhiannon for the meal, and drove myself home, past the same streets I'd driven 100 times before, understanding with total clarity exactly what I needed to do next. I drove home with the windows down, the cool evening air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage. Something quieter and colder than that, clarity. Somewhere along that dark road, I thought about every 4th of July Roland and I had spent at that same grill, decades before either of us imagined that particular patio would eventually become the last place I ever saw him standing upright. I thought, too, about the years since his death, learning to manage every part of our own finances and property alone, the maintenance fees, the annual renewal paperwork, the small administrative details he'd once handled without complaint. Widowhood had taught me, whether I wanted the lesson or not, that I was considerably more capable than anyone, including myself at times, had given me credit for. I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me now, and I understood with total clarity exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. I called my old friend Perpetua before I called the resort's own ownership office. A woman I'd worked alongside for over 2 decades, transcribing testimony in the same regional courthouse, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a specific, documented detail actually mattered. I told her the whole story, 3 years of gradual erosion, the dinner announcement, the exact week finally named out loud in front of the whole family. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Cordelia," she finally said, "you spent 39 years making certain the official record matched exactly what actually happened, down to the smallest detail. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the record in question happens to be your own husband's death." "I keep waiting to feel like I'm overreacting to one dinner conversation," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Perpetua said, "because you're not overreacting. Someone tried to quietly move the exact week your husband died, without ever asking you directly, and only stopped when you finally said so out loud in front of the entire family. That's not an overreaction. That's exactly the correction that situation actually required." The following morning, I called the resort's ownership services office directly, reaching a careful representative named Delphine Ocasio, who had handled our account's renewal paperwork for years, explaining that I wanted to formally confirm and lock the deed restrictions on my own timeshare week, ensuring that no exchange, conversion, or scheduling modification could ever be processed without my own direct, verified signature and authorization, regardless of who else in the family might attempt to initiate such a request in the future. Delphine, genuinely helpful once she understood the situation, walked me through the resort's own formal ownership protection process, confirming that as the sole deed holder, I had every right to establish exactly that kind of restriction permanently. She also mentioned gently that she remembered our own account specifically, having processed the paperwork the year Roland died, and that she'd always privately hoped the family had kept returning for the right reasons. Those first few days after the dinner were harder than I expected. I found myself, more than once, reaching for the phone to call the resort and tell them to hold off. That surely there was some gentler way to make my point without formally locking anything. I sat on my own porch one entire evening, looking through old photographs from that very first July at the resort, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Perpetua's words, remembering the actual weight of Rhiannon's bright, confident announcement about August, remembering that gentler corrections had already had 3 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not attempt to exclude Nolan, Rhiannon, or anyone else from ever attending the reunion again. I formally confirmed my sole ownership authority over the deeded week, established a permanent restriction requiring my own direct authorization for any future changes, and had my own attorney draft a brief, factual letter to Nolan and Rhiannon confirming exactly what had been established and why, along with a formal accounting of the previous inquiries Rhiannon had made without my knowledge. I sent that letter through my attorney's office, with the resort's own documentation attached. The same plain factual language that could have applied to any property ownership matter anywhere in the state. Nolan called the following morning, his voice tight with confusion and hurt. Mom, locking the deed feels like you're treating Rhiannon and me as adversaries instead of just talking this through as a family. I understand it might feel that way, I said calmly, but someone has spent 3 years quietly working to move or convert the exact week your father died, without ever directly discussing it with me first, right up until she announced the change as already decided at our own family dinner. I'm not trying to become anyone's adversary. I'm trying to make certain that particular week can never again be treated as simply negotiable. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't feel like a legal action against your own family. There is, I said. If Rhiannon is willing to sit down with me directly and have an honest conversation about what that specific week actually represents, and agree to consult me directly on any future logistics involving it, I'm entirely open to her continued help with everything else. I'm not interested in excluding her from this family's planning. I'm interested in making certain the one detail that actually matters most to me remains protected. Rhiannon called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Cordelia, this feels completely disproportionate. You're treating a scheduling conversation like a serious betrayal? No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you spend 3 years quietly researching how to move or convert the exact week my husband died, right up until you announced that change to the entire family before ever discussing it with me directly. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I finally understood exactly how far that research had actually gone. I was only trying to make the reunion work better for the whole family going forward. I believe that you believe that, I said. But that specific week was never simply a logistics problem to be optimized. It was the last place I ever saw my husband alive, and the place our entire family has returned to every year since, specifically because of what it represents. Those are very different things, Rhiannon, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you stopped mentioning why that week actually mattered to anyone you spoke with about changing it. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back to my own quiet living room, understanding that whatever came next would take considerable time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Nolan called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's insistence that this had all been reasonable planning and a growing understanding of exactly how much history had actually been at stake. Ginevra, once she heard the whole story, offered to fly in and sit with Nolan directly, walking him through exactly what that specific week had meant to their own father, the way only a sibling who'd grown up spending every summer at that same resort could properly convey. She told me later that she'd brought her own childhood photo albums to that conversation, laying out picture after picture of every single July at that resort, watching her brother's face change as he traced the actual continuity of a tradition he'd apparently stopped consciously connecting to their own father's death. I don't think he understood how much he'd let that connection fade until he saw 30 years of photographs laid out in front of him at once, Ginevra told me. He kept saying, "I know Dad died there. I just stopped thinking about it every single time the subject of scheduling came up." That's exactly the problem, Ginevra told him. You stopped thinking about it, and Rhiannon never started. About 2 weeks after my letter went out, Nolan asked if I'd be willing to sit down with him and Rhiannon together before things settled into anything more permanently strained. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could resolve this honestly without losing an entire family tradition to bitterness. When the conversation began, Nolan sat across from me at my own kitchen table, Rhiannon beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. "Mom," Nolan began, "we wanted to talk through everything properly, figure out what happens next for all of us." "I'm listening," I said. Rhiannon spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. "I think I genuinely believed I was helping modernize something that had simply become logistically difficult. I know the dinner announcement landed badly, but formally locking the deed with no warning beyond what was legally required felt like it was designed to make me look like a villain in front of the entire family. Was that the intention?" I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching the exact place and moment of my husband's death get quietly treated as a scheduling convenience. If it embarrassed you, I understand that it might. It should, a little. 3 years of quiet erosion doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose this family's trust in my judgment about planning anything ever again, Rhiannon said, her composure cracking slightly. "Is that really what you wanted?" "What I wanted," I said, "was to stop having the single most significant week of my entire life treated as simply negotiable. I never once asked you to stop helping with logistics. I only asked from the very beginning that this one specific detail remain untouched, and somewhere along the way, that request stopped being honored at all." Nolan was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned toward Rhiannon directly, his voice low, but clear enough for me to hear as well. "You knew why that week mattered," he said. "I told you myself early on exactly what happened to Dad there. I don't understand how that eventually became something you thought was reasonable to quietly work around." Rhiannon's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire conversation, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix something that started with me genuinely wanting to help this family plan better," she said, almost to herself. "You start by asking instead of deciding," I told her, every single time, starting now, especially about anything connected to that particular week. "I'd like that," Nolan said. "I've been waiting 3 years to hear it said plainly." About 3 weeks later, Nolan came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. "I keep thinking about the day Dad died," he said. I was the one who called the ambulance, standing right there on that patio, watching you kneel beside him on the concrete, while I tried to remember our own address to give the dispatcher. I still remember exactly which tile his spatula landed on. I don't know when I stopped connecting that memory to the actual date on a calendar Rhiannon was trying to move. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you say something sooner, before it went on for 3 years? Because I kept telling myself it wasn't really about erasing Dad's memory, he said. It was just about logistics, about making things easier for everyone. I think I forgot that easier, and erasing an actual, essential memory aren't the same thing. Rhiannon came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our earlier conversation had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing this family's trust entirely, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Cordelia, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to prove I could handle planning something this important well. Of course you wanted that, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine effort or your organizational skill. I only ever wanted the specific meaning behind that 1 week to remain part of the planning, rather than something quietly optimized away. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting to prove my own competence turned into believing I was entitled to simply improve on something I didn't fully understand the weight of. I think I convinced myself that asking you directly every single time would make me look less capable somehow, so I found ways around asking at all. You were never meant to prove your competence by overriding what actually mattered to me, Rhiannon, I told her. You were meant to help carry the tradition forward honestly. Weight and all. Those are very different things. I don't know how to undo 3 years of getting that wrong, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You start asking plainly every single time it matters and let the tradition going forward finally be honest about what it actually represents. Can I ask you something? She said. Why did you keep giving me the benefit of the doubt for so long? Even after the point system inquiry? Even after the comment about modernizing the reunion? Because I wanted so badly for you to be exactly who I hoped you'd be for this family, I admitted. It's a very particular kind of hope. Watching your son build a life with someone hoping she'll turn out to genuinely understand what matters most to everyone she's joining. I think I let that hope talk me out of trusting my own instincts for longer than I should have. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. About Roland, about that specific patio, about what the reunion had actually been built to carry every single year. I showed her old photographs from that very first July week, nearly 3 decades earlier. Roland standing at a considerably smaller grill. Our own children still small enough to be carried on his shoulders down to the water. Rhiannon looked through those photographs slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me put together a proper written history of the tradition, something the family could actually read and understand fully, rather than simply inherit as an unexplained fixed date. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Nolan and Rhiannon began seeing a counselor together that autumn, specifically to address the underlying assumptions driving how they approached family tradition and planning, something neither of them had properly examined before. Rhiannon told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying how they'd approached improving family logistics. We both said, efficiency, almost at the same time, Rhiannon said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called efficiency actually meant quietly flattening meaning we didn't fully understand into something more convenient to manage. I called my own attorney, a sharp woman named Henrietta Caldwell, whom I'd worked with on several estate matters since Roland's death, a few weeks after the initial letter went out, to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family's own reconciliation had moved forward faster than either of us expected. Cordelia, I've handled a lot of these property protection matters over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a deed restriction I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure grief than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood decades ago exactly how easily a deeply meaningful place and date can slip away from its rightful significance once someone else starts managing it. The fact that you eventually needed to formally protect it doesn't make you any less careful for having chosen it so deliberately in the first place. Ginevra flew in for that year's reunion, held exactly during the first week of July as it always had been. The first time in years that both of my children had gathered at that same resort at once, the smell of charcoal and ocean air filling the same patio where Roland had once stood. Nolan and Rhiannon arrived with the same easy warmth as everyone else. No elaborate announcement, simply present exactly where the tradition had always required. Over the reunion's own traditional dinner, Ginevra's husband Osgood asked, innocently enough, how the whole situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Rhiannon simply said, I let wanting to prove myself turn into almost erasing the one thing that actually made this week sacred to begin with. Cordelia made sure I finally understood what I'd nearly done. We're doing this properly now, together. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Osgood, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Rhiannon how it had felt, realizing the truth so directly. Rhiannon was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Humbling isn't a strong enough word, she said. I think I finally understood what it costs someone else when you let efficient planning replace an accurate understanding of what actually matters. I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant reunion dinner. Rhiannon called her own mother that same autumn, correcting at last the impression she'd left at that earlier family gathering. Nolan told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether efficiency was, well, really the same thing as respect for a tradition she didn't fully understand. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Nolan's or Rhiannon's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of the family's tradition she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. A few weeks after that reunion, a card arrived in my mailbox, Nolan's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Rhiannon's version of practical planning become the only version anyone discussed, including me. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually protect what that week means myself now, out loud, without waiting for you to have to fight for it through the resort's own paperwork again. Thank you for finally making certain all of us understood what that week was actually worth. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Rhiannon's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Cordelia, I spent 3 years building an identity around efficient planning that nearly erased the one thing that made this family's tradition actually meaningful. I'm sorry it took locking a legal deed for me to understand what that erasure could have cost all of us. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside an old photograph of Roland at that very first grill, decades earlier, grinning at whoever was behind the camera. I think he would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think he would have been quietly satisfied that the record eventually corrected itself. I called Delphine at the resort's own office a few weeks after everything settled to thank her properly for her patience during that initial difficult call. Cordelia, she told me, I've processed a lot of ownership disputes over the years, and most families never actually resolve them the way yours did. I'm glad you all found your way back to that patio together. I told her I appreciated more than she probably realized how much her own careful handling of that first call had actually mattered. The written history Rhiannon helped me compile that spring now sits in a simple binder in the resort unit itself, available for any family member, present or future, to read and understand exactly why that particular week has never been simply a convenient date on a calendar. Rhiannon requested herself that a specific page be added describing exactly what had nearly happened and what she'd learned from it, believing future generations deserved the honest version of that history as much as the original, happier one. I saw Perpetua again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe near the old courthouse where we'd talked through everything the week of that difficult dinner, a habit neither of us had ever quite let go of, even decades after retiring. I told her about the reconciliation, the written history, the honest conversations at my own kitchen table. Perpetua listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter holding that line, she said. Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually protected, not just the deed, the truth back. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the entire time. Do you regret any of it? Perpetua asked gently. The 3 years of silence before you finally acted? I regret the silence, I told her. I don't regret welcoming Rhiannon's help originally, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it, in some strange way, to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when Roland and I first chose that specific week, nearly 3 decades ago. I think about that ordinary Sunday dinner often, my own fork still resting on the edge of my plate, my daughter-in-law's bright, confident voice announcing a change she believed was already settled. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely. A family finally required to reckon honestly with the meaning it had been quietly editing. I don't regret choosing that specific week with Roland nearly 3 decades ago. Building a tradition our whole family could count on mattered to us then, and it still matters to me now. What I regret is how long I allowed the small, uncomfortable signs of erosion to go unaddressed before I finally insisted the record reflect what that week had actually always meant. Real tradition was never meant to require its own most essential meaning to be quietly optimized away. And I intend to make certain that particular week remains exactly what it has always been for as long as I'm able to protect it. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet accommodation was itself sufficient protection, that a good mother-in-law simply trusted her family to understand a tradition's meaning without ever needing anything formally protected. I no longer believe that. Trusting shared understanding to protect itself isn't sufficient. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of vulnerability, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to formally protect what actually matters. I think about the specific moments now, with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The offhand mention of the point system, the unauthorized inquiry to the resort's own office, the conversation with a cousin that stopped mentioning why the week mattered at all. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, A pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the dinner announcement was an isolated lapse rather than the culmination of 3 years of careful, escalating reassignment. Rhiannon may not have set out from the very beginning intending to erase Roland's memory specifically, but the cumulative pattern moved in exactly that direction, regardless of when she might have fully recognized it herself. Real tradition, I've come to believe, was never actually about rigid resistance to change for its own sake. It was about protecting the specific meaning behind a shared memory honestly, rather than treating that meaning as endlessly negotiable simply because negotiating it felt more practical in the moment. If a family member needs you to treat your own most significant memory as simply another logistics problem to be optimized, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait and see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a single misplaced word in an otherwise accurate transcript. You can let it stand if you want to, telling yourself it's close enough. It's never actually close enough. It's simply a discrepancy, waiting for someone finally willing to go back and correct the actual record. I think sometimes about all those years behind that stenography machine, learning that every honest record depends on capturing exactly what happened, not a more convenient approximation of it. It took me 73 years and one very ordinary Sunday dinner to apply that same standard fully to my own family's most significant tradition. I welcomed Rhiannon's help freely, and I would welcome it exactly the same way again. But I no longer accept quiet erosion of my own most essential memories as simply the price of keeping peace in a growing family. If I am the one who chose, deliberately and specifically, exactly what that week should always mean, I intend to remain the one protecting that meaning, not because I distrust everyone who loves me, but because pretending vigilance was ever unnecessary was never actually true. The family gathers at that same resort every first week of July now. Exactly as it always has, Rhiannon always asking me directly now, well in advance, whether any particular detail she's planning actually honors what the week represents before finalizing anything further. Ginevra flew in specially for last year's gathering, standing near that same patio railing with genuine warmth on her face, watching Rhiannon ask me, plainly, whether a small memorial plaque she'd proposed for the grill area actually felt right, rather than assuming any tribute remained hers alone to decide. The resort installed that small plaque the following spring, a simple engraved line reading in loving memory of Roland Whitmore, who never once missed a 4th of July at this exact spot. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 3 years. I am 73 years old, a widow, a retired court reporter, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly trusts her family to protect her own most significant memories without ever formally securing that protection herself. That particular version of me stayed behind at an ordinary Sunday dinner table, along with an unfinished meal and an announcement about August that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to correct. I sat down at that table that evening as one woman, and I stood back up as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Rhiannon first offered to help with the reunion's logistics, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would welcome that help again, exactly the same way, because her genuine desire to contribute was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that shared understanding alone would naturally protect something as specific and essential as that particular week, that nearly 3 decades of deliberate tradition could survive on its own weight, without anyone occasionally insisting it be honored directly. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the help I welcomed. It would be the 3 years of small, uncomfortable signs I let slide, signs I mistook, again and again for reasonable modernization rather than what they actually were. A slow and quiet erosion of the last place I ever stood beside my own husband. Ginevra's own children ask me sometimes, whenever we return to that same resort, to tell them the whole story of why Grandma and Grandpa chose that exact week so many years ago. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete. The sandcastles, the smaller grill, the ordinary 4th of July afternoon that became, without any warning at all, the last one Roland and I ever spent together, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually returns there every year. No detail softened, no memory left unspoken. These days, when anyone asks why this family returns to the same resort during the same week every single summer, they hear the whole story: the sandcastles, the smaller grill, an ordinary afternoon that became, without warning, the most significant week of an entire family's shared life. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of that week's protected place as I always should have been.